quick show of hands, did anybody actually get the chance? I see a few books scattered around in here to read the chapter ahead. Cool, good. Even if you only glanced over it, totally fine. Again, show of hands, has anybody checked Blackboard since yesterday evening? Are things showing up for this class?
Sir?
Are things showing up for the class?
No, sir.
No?
No, sir.
Nothing at all?
No, nothing at all.
That is so not good. I will work with it. I have office hours right after this class. I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it until then. Can't stress that enough. All right, so today we are going to be talking about about 150, 200 year gap of time from roughly 1400 to 1600 Common Era. So a lot of people still think AD, BC. That's a little dated in historic terms now. Typically we refer, thank you very much, sir, we refer to time more in BCE or before Common Era, and then CE, Common Era. Effectively, the break in time is the same. Y'all may remember this from 1010 or previous history courses. AD, BC, Anno Domini, etc. we're in AD times now, the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. If you don't speak Latin, I don't expect you to. It's a dead language, except for in Vatican City, but irrelevant. And then BC, everyone knows, is before the 0 to now. All right. BCE, CE is what I prefer to use. So just to, again, cue your ears up to hear the small difference. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on the Afro to Eurasian trade routes and, of course, the effects that, came from that. Prior to the 16th century, which is the 1500s, for those of y'all who don't think centuries to hundreds, if you will. Remember, we're in the 21st century now and we're in the 2000s. So if you ever forget, think 15th century back one for the hundreds amount of years. So before the 16th century or 1500s, European powers were very much weaker than they would become in the following century. The strength lay still less in military might, although that always played a very strong hand, but more in the value of the trade markets that you were influenced by and hopefully controlled. Those trade markets were everything and anything. I mean, think of everything you use today and imagine that the want for something that filled that need, even 500 years ago, was not much different. You want to write a note, you need someone to have made a tool for you to take a note with. Not many people were literate enough to write notes at the time necessarily. A lot were, but you get what I'm saying. All of these things that are very specialized in use that we take for granted now, they wanted those back then. And in a lot of ways, that's what people traded for. The goods you didn't have that you wanted to make your life easier. Yeah, makes sense. Of course, there's always monetary value in that, controlling it especially so. So, again, as the European powers were not as influential at the time, who were the big powerhouses, kingdoms that we're going to talk about? We're going to start with a couple of African kingdoms, a few specifics, but none necessarily in depth. Again, may not have mentioned this in yesterday's class or first period's class. I'm a huge movie nut, or movie, TV, etc. A lot of my 8th graders, when I taught the section, were like, how much was Wakanda like this in the movies or in the comic books? Got to be honest, I think they did a great job showing a lot of what historians conceptualize as early life. Either way, beyond that, that was just a little aside from my own nerdiness. We're going to be talking a couple of the African kingdoms, especially in northern and western Africa. Now, again, I have a very poor map indeed pulled up for these purposes. But as you see right here, we have Egypt. That is the northeastern side. So top again, but go to the other side and a little bit down. This general area we're talking about, I'll pull up a map in a little bit if we need to. So some of the main things that were getting traded at the time, you probably remember this from previous history courses. Spices. Throw up a hand if you remember another early common trading item that was big in the world at the time. Silk, absolutely. What would make you say silk in particular? Hey, that's a good reason. Straight from the book. Not to jump ahead too far, but the Silk Road, since y'all are of the correct internet generation, who's heard of the Silk Road these days? Yeah, yeah. What was it used for in modern terms? What was the Silk Road all about? Sadly, online illegal trade. Like if you wanted explosives, guns, drugs, anything illegal, and I mean some legal stuff too. So the creators of the website said it was a black market website that was untraceable or hard to trace. The creator of that website, that concept, the marketplace, took his name from the incredibly lucrative Chinese / Mongol trade routes through China across from India and other destinations that made Chinese dynasties, Mongol dynasties too, very, very wealthy. That trade route, loosely termed, was called the Silk Road. So the modern guy who created the marketplace online for all of the goods that, you want what you don't have, so you go to the Silk Road. Well, he took the name straight from history, and in a very weird way, it makes sense. Okay, sorry, that was again a jump ahead to a little bit of China. So African kingdoms had travelers, had boats and overland masses, just like everybody else did. And these guys, and gals too, ostensibly, would travel, if not from the western side, across the Sahara, which again is big old desert right at the top of Africa. And then they would either cross into Saudi Arabia via the Red Sea, right there. I think we've all heard of the Red Sea at some point. Or again, from, say, Ethiopia, they would take boats and cross to, you guessed it, India, right through the Indian Ocean. That's why I have the map pulled up. And all through the Arabian Peninsula, which again, anyone other than Saudi Arabia, because it's obvious it's up on the map. Arabian Peninsula. Anyone want to throw a, I guess, modern day country of what we consider the Arabian Peninsula out at me? This is a little bit of a geography test too, / see who's awake.
Afghanistan.
Modern day, okay. Iraq, Iran, the general area that we consider the Middle East by today's standards. That was a heavy trade route of overland trade from Northern Africa. So yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to put exact because I don't know geography well enough to be like, yes, I remember the trade routes going through what is now there, but correct part of the world. All right, so China, Arabian Peninsula to India. Again, Silk Road for Chinese purposes, incredibly lucrative. Made tons of money for these people with just, the physical goods that they were trading. What else goes along trade routes, though? Like, it's not just the physical goods. People got to take the goods with them, right? I mean, they don't just teleport there. So with those people come their ideas of culture, their language, their money. Religion is one that we're going to focus on a lot in here because obviously that's a big, I guess, what's a good word for it? A good engine for a lot of historical events is religion. A lot of things happen that we remember for religious purposes, be they war or celebrations of good things. But as these trade routes continued to snake their way through across the general area, areas started, or kingdoms started establishing stop points along. Places like Baghdad, spelled differently, but in the exact same place that it is today, would date back thousands, hundreds and 1,000 of years, not hundreds of thousands, obviously, that'd be way too far, but dates all the way back, and they arrived, and they being historians typically arrive at the conclusion that a lot of these places are where they are for two reasons. One, water is typically a bit more plentiful around a lot, but not all early sites. You might remember that from 1010, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Nile, studying all of that. And trade routes, again, because you've got so much money, and let's face it, at the time, travel was not as easy as getting into a car or plane. It was a lot more, hey, you made 20 miles today? Awesome, that is good progress. You need a place to stop every 20 miles or so, or maybe you made 80 miles in a day, who knows. But you needed places to stop. Those places became trading depots. Over hundreds of years, they evolved into metropolitan cities that frequently became, again, very wealthy and powerful for that reason. So, again, as we progress through this chapter, if a name of a place sounds familiar, even though we're talking about it, from 600 years ago, don't worry. There's a reason it sounds familiar. It's supposed to. All right. The growth of empires led to further European expansion, though. Obviously, as European powers grew in strength, they wanted a piece of the trade. They wanted money. Why did Christopher Columbus get sent? What was that for? What was his goal in going to explore for new trade routes to trade? What?
Gold.
Spices was, I think, typically the one that I remember from elementary and middle school being like, oh yeah, he was searching for new spice routes to get to, the valuable spices being traded at the time. But gold, I'm sure, is definitely a big factor, as always is. Yes, sir.
Back home, what I was said about why, Columbus and Alvarez and all those guys came over to America was for, in terms of the Spanish kingdom was to save them from bankruptcy.
Really?
Yes, sir. And then, they came to the Aztec Empire and they took their gold and they traded, gold and information and culture.
Yes. Yeah.
That's why Latin America is very Catholic and obviously we speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And also corn products to take back to Europe.
Absolutely.
Because potatoes and wheat was not growing at a rate where it was going to support their growing population.
Are you a historian in the making, or is this just because you are? Where are you from again, by the way? You said
El Salvador.
El Salvador. Very good, very good. So you do have a different take on it than we do as Americans typically. So let me ask, how is Columbus discussed, if at all, in your history in El Salvador?
Well, the conquistador that came over to go to Central America, but
so for us, he's typically, until more recently, viewed as like the good guy, the one that brought, came, and he's the reason we're all here. What's the take on it from, some?
for me,
yeah.
For me personally, I don't care. It's modern development.
Fair. Yeah.
But I don't know. People say that the Europeans came over and they just stole all his goods, but it's would you rather be browsing the internet or counting the cow babies,
Absolutely. Interesting take. Thank you very much. And actually, it's funny you mentioned Columbus because his name is smack dab in the middle of the concept you were just talking about, the trade of, tobacco, potatoes, corn, etc. between the places. It's called the Colombian Exchange. And as we are in the dead center and hopefully trailing off towards the end of a global pandemic right now of, not fun proportions, one of those things that we're going to talk about coming across from the old world to the new, which is old world being Eurasia, Europe, what we think of now, Spain, Portugal being the two that we're going to mention most today. And then the new world, which of course is, what we think of now as the Americas. So the exchange of ideas between the two became known as the Colombian Exchange after, of course, Christopher Columbus. And I guess now we're going to dive into a couple of the ways that was beneficial. The Colombian Exchange definitely has helped us get as humans where we are now, both on this side of the Atlantic and the other. But again, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and history is built on diseases and death, we may as well focus a little bit on some of the interesting diseases that came across and traveled both ways. Really, the New World over here, the indigenous people over here, very, very healthy in comparison. I'm going to list off a few in a second, but really the only disease that came from the New World, where we are now, the Americas, over back to Europe, and again, with Columbus's sailors, so, thank him for something else entirely, was syphilis. Yeah, common STD that is super treatable now. Back then, it was the scourge. A lot of the indigenous cultures over here, through time, it of course built up, immunities to it, or at least it was less deadly. As soon as the Columbus, the sailors of Columbus's crew came back, theoretically it was one of them, some of them, several of them, and started spreading syphilis. Again, is through sexual contact and that only. So we know how it spreads. It hit Europe and just, yeah, killed a lot of folks, made a lot of people very, very, very ill. And it is, again, dated to basically the year that Columbus and his crew returned from the Americas for the first time, is the start of it appearing in Europe. So very clear link, obviously. In return for syphilis, if you like to look at it that way, I don't, because it's kind of dark and gruesome, but either way, some of the diseases that eventually made it over in the Colombian Exchange from Eurasia to the New World. Long list. Don't worry about writing them all down. Bubonic Plague. Yeah, we've all heard of that one. Black Death. Yeah, not a lot of fun. 1347, 48 Europe. Not a good time. 70+% of the population dead. We actually still have in America, I forget what the NPR article said, but roughly 6 to 10 cases of bubonic plague a year. Like, it's still living out, especially out west. You'll get fleas on like prairie dogs and stuff. People will come across a prairie dog and get too close, and some of the fleas will jump off. And there is still bubonic plague with us today in the States. It's very treatable now, again, but people still die of it. That came over. Smallpox, again, not one that we think a lot about now, because it was actually one that, if memory serves, the doctor who came up with the concept of vaccines was actually fighting, I believe, 99% sure, smallpox. Now, again, terrible scourge, deformed a lot of people, killed a lot of people. Back before sanitation was so good, you hear about a lot of these diseases calling like lesions on the skin. And I was like, oh, that's gross. Back in the day, and I mean less than 100 years ago, if those ruptured, you were going to get an infection. They didn't know how to fight infections back when this was happening. It was like, oh yeah, rub some mercury on it. It'll go away. Yeah, well, mercury kills you. Like, it poisons you and forms in your brain and makes you go crazy. That's why you have the term mad as a hatter. They used to rub mercury onto hats to make them shine. It leached in through their skin, and people that were hatters, made hats, became mad as a hatter. So when you watch Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter, that's where it comes from. He has mercury poisoning. Sad day, right? History's all about making days happy. So with the smallpox, back to the vaccine, he actually used a different form of a pox to inoculate I believe, both of his children, the doctor who came up with this, Dr. Salk. And it turns out, lo and behold, that the weaker form of pox that he dosed his children with formed a resistance to smallpox. And thus we, eliminated that scourge, but that was not for several hundred years. When it came over, it's the reason that the Aztecs fell in no small part. I mean, cannons and swords helped too, but a lot of them were dropping dead because Cortez and his crew, or excuse me, any of the conquistadors, not just Cortez, but any of the conquistadors that came over from Spain and Portugal, Spain in that case, they brought smallpox, and it hit and knocked out up to 70% of the indigenous population. And that's through Central South America, North America, what we think of now, the different Americas. For the purposes of right now in this class, just think of it as all as one Americas, from very south of South America all the way to really the top hat of Canada, but our northern border, effectively. So smallpox was effectively the Black Death of the New World, if you want to look at it that way. Similar amounts of people dropped dead, but it's a lot harder to fight better armed people when you've got 70+% of your people dead or dying. Like, just not good times to defend yourself. Measles, another one that we take for granted today with a little, my 4-month-old has already gotten his inoculation, or his first one, for measles. Again, causes fever, brings on death, especially before you can fight that off. Typhus, anyone who's familiar with the old story of Typhoid Mary, it is a disease that causes dehydration through either diarrhea or throwing up, and it's passed through feces. Now, again, this speaks to the time. People had an awareness of like, hey, I don't want stuff on my food, so they'd clean their hands at that point. But water wasn't boiled. It still had bacteria in it, and typhus was very common in Europe. Not in the New World, until, of course, the Colombian Exchange happened. Sorry, he might be done, or they might be done with this very soon, or it might be all class long. Who knows? All right, so any questions thus far about where we are in my babbling long history of the chapter so far? No? Good deal. Okay. Do I need to go back, clear anything up? Awesome. Great deal. So, cholera, whooping cough, again, we don't have to go into depth in all of these diseases, but just to give you a general overview of how many came over with the, again, European explorers versus how many went back. Yeah, it's remarkable. Let's see. So, of course, from 1493 to 1498, that is when the syphilis kind of went wild. If Columbus left in 1492, he got here being, Hispaniola, Cuba area in, I believe it was October of that year, found stuff, said, hey, I can find my way back, kicked it back to Spain. He made it back right in 1493. So again, when the years line up that directly on when syphilis emerged and when Columbus comes back, especially with DNA testing and stuff, we know now that it does in fact go back to, I want to say syphilis is from the Guyana area of South America now that we have called it now Guyana. That's science that's way above my head. I won't hold you to account for that. Either way, beyond that. So the need for labor in the South American colonies was also a big bringer of death for the indigenous people. It became a lot about planting sugarcane, and that was the spice of choice for a lot of European, Spanish and Portuguese powers at this point. With that came, of course, a tragic amount of enslavement, and of course, with that came death. The replacement for that, and this is, again, we're just covering all points of the chapter before we go in depth on anything. This is, of course, the origins of the African slave trade, because if your indigenous people die and you still need that sugarcane grown and cut and processed, what are you going to do? You're going to pay someone to do it? Not back then, you weren't. You were going to, of course, go to Africa and partake of slaves. So, again, this is not going to be a terribly uplifting chapter. Nothing about the Colombian Exchange other than the good foods that we got. And, of course, there's some ideas that came through in a religious sense that appeal to many people. But the dark side of the Colombian Exchange is vast. So stick with it. It's not going to get much happier in this, But we are going to have fun learning about it. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone yet. Awesome. So this is why I have the map up. For context, the Indian Ocean is huge. I stole that straight from the book. It is a direct quote. They then follow that up with saying, of the world's ocean area, it is roughly 20% or 1/5. So again, we're talking a very large area that people were choosing to take what we would consider very basic watercraft by our standards today and sailing all the way across, down, up through these areas, down the coast, all the way to about there is where a Chinese, Admiral Hugh, I want to say his name was, made it all the way down to about there, about 100 years or maybe a little less than 100 years before Columbus left Spain to make it over to where we are. So again, to put things in context, we've got a lot to cover. Trade routes were recorded as early as the 1500s by the Arab trader Ibn Majid. If I mispronounced that name, I do apologize. He is, I believe, an underlined or bold vocab term in your book. He is also very easy to find extra information about online. I do recommend if you have any, I can't tell y'all how many times, and again, I'm a history nerd, so follow that and take it with a grain of salt. I will find a name like this in notes and do a 2-second Google search and then end up reading for an hour on this person's life because, we all think we have fairly boring lives. And then we read about someone else's and we're like, wow, that's so interesting. But it's, again, that's the great thing about being a historian now. I encourage that outside research. Don't just settle for the book. It's a good resource, but I don't know, but he was the first guy that recorded some of these trade routes. I'm betting he's got a fascinating story. Yes, sir.
Who is the name again?
Ibn Majid, and I have it probably mispronounced horribly, and I do apologize for that if I do. He also noted the monsoon seasons, which again in Southeast Asia, where he was doing a lot of his trading and I guess early map making or noting of trade routes. Very, very important. I've never lived through a monsoon myself, but I understand that it would make trade and travel very, very difficult for large parts of a year. Again, for those of y'all that are not familiar, I think we're all familiar with what a monsoon is, as far as just, torrents and torrents of rain, rivers rising for weeks, months at a time, depending on how long the season is. Yeah, so, having a knowledge of that too, especially 500 years ago when you're traveling, you don't want to arrive in the middle of a monsoon season. So the text that he wrote would become very invaluable for traders. It's good to know these things so you don't die. All right, so from roughly 600 to the 1300s, there was an increase in the use of the Indian Ocean, and it was brought on by a couple of things. The spread of Islam. Like I said earlier, religion is a lot of the, engine of different things in history. It moves it on along. The Unification of China is also another one. And Unification of China is a little bit more of the broad concept that we'll be thinking about. Nature abhors a vacuum, I think is the term I've always heard, and that refers to power as well as a scientific, vacuum. And stability and money go hand in hand. That's how I've always thought about it. So, prime example, if there's an unpopular government in power in any country, a lot of times, even if they're unpopular, but they're a strong government, their stock market will react well. And it's because that money is following whoever is appearing to be in power. Like, the government appears strong, cool, we can invest. We can believe that something is strong there. You don't have to like it, it just has to be strong. That's the concept with the unification of China. There were other kingdoms along the trade route between China, India, and Africa that had grown big, grown very powerful, very rich. But it was the unification of such a large area. And again, China is very vast, and the area that it encompassed then would also be what we consider Korea today in no small part. So the trade routes that snaked along this edge here through India, up and around, and then again through the Indian Ocean, once you made it into the United Kingdoms of China, or the kingdom that was united under Chinese rule, it was a lot safer on the roads were better cared for, money was a little more standardized. You had a lot of things that, a strong government can provide for citizens. Doesn't mean the government's necessarily pro-citizen, it just means they're pro-money, so they keep things up. Either way, that's a very large swath. I don't want you to read too much into what I just said about governments. I like governments. They give us paved roads, among other things. But that is in fact why, again, you'll see a lot of the, once areas in history become much more unified, they will start growing economically. And that's not just because there's more people. It's because, again, there's that faith in a stronger entity to back up whatever you're investing in. Yeah. Sorry, I know that's kind of a economics concept as much as anything, but history and economics play a lot of, they hold hands a lot. All right, so Arab traders favored trading with political states that were very stable in parts of China, and Islam, of course, spread with a lot of the Arab traders and along those trade routes. So you see Islam blow up in North Africa through parts of what we now consider Arabia in the Middle East, all the way through India. Hinduism and Buddhism were established in India too, so there's a little kind of a mixing, if you will, of Islam and India, and even into parts of China, where again you have Taoism and other beliefs slowing Islam a bit. But I want to say, and I didn't write it down, in a matter of like a couple of 100 years, and maybe even 150, it had gone from, like Christianity, a very pocket small religion, monotheistic religion, which again, pretty common at the time that we're talking about, but not universal, it spread and took over along the trade routes, and very, very, very quickly, very effectively. And it's still very prevalent in most of the areas that it got started and, held on to. All right, so that kind of is the end of the overview. Now, apologies if we have gotten super long-winded and boring and any of that. We're going to focus on a couple of the dynasties and people from China right now that really got their trade and unification started. At this point, though, if anyone would like to take a quick sojourn to the restroom, step out, have a drink of water, anything like that, I would not mind stopping talking for about 2 or 3 minutes, just to be honest with you. So we're going to take about a 2-minute break